They thought he was just another quiet compliance officer, until the day he brought down a billionaire empire. The elevators opened onto the 43rd floor of Sterling Global Holdings at exactly 7:30 every morning. Before the executives arrived, before the conference rooms filled with expensive suits and rehearsed smiles, one man was already at his desk. His name was Daniel Walker. For 15 years, he had walked through the same glass doors carrying the same worn leather briefcase. He never arrived late. He never left unfinished work behind. He never complained. While ambitious executives fought for promotions and recognition, Daniel quietly ensured that reports were accurate, compliance records were complete, and every financial document met federal regulations. Yet almost no one knew his name. To most employees, he was simply the quiet man from compliance. People greeted one another with warm smiles as they entered the office, but Daniel was usually met with silence. Some walked past him without making eye contact. Others looked at him only when they needed someone to blame for a delayed report or an inconvenient audit. He had become invisible, not because he lacked intelligence, because the people around him believed kindness was weakness. The first insult came before 8 o'clock. Daniel had barely settled into his chair when the head of marketing, Gregory Mills, tossed a thick stack of folders onto his desk. "I need these reviewed in an hour," Gregory said, without even looking at him. Daniel opened the top folder. "These belong to legal," he replied calmly. "Compliance isn't responsible for contract revisions." Gregory smirked. "You've got plenty of free time. Figure it out." Without waiting for an answer, Gregory walked away, laughing with two department managers. Daniel simply gathered the folders and began reading. Across the office, whispers spread. "There he goes again. He never says no. No wonder they walk all over him." Their laughter blended into the endless hum of keyboards and ringing phones. Daniel heard every word. He simply refused to answer them. Around noon, the executive board assembled in the largest conference room for the quarterly financial review. Daniel entered carrying several compliance reports that had taken weeks to prepare. He placed them neatly before each executive. Richard Sterling, the company's legendary CEO, barely glanced at the documents before pushing them aside. "We'll review those later," he said. Victoria Hayes, the chief financial officer, smiled with open contempt. "Compliance always worries about rules." Several executives chuckled. "We're here to make money, Daniel," another director added, "not read bedtime stories." The room erupted with laughter. Daniel remained standing. "There are irregularities in the overseas accounts," he said calmly. "They should be investigated immediately." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Are you accusing this company of wrongdoing?" "I'm saying the numbers don't reconcile." Victoria folded her arms. "Perhaps your calculations are wrong." Daniel looked directly at her. "I checked them 6 times. For a brief moment, silence settled across the room. Then Richard laughed. A deep, confident laugh that quickly spread around the table. "Daniel," Richard said, "do you know why you've never been promoted?" Daniel said nothing. "Because leadership requires confidence. You spend your life looking for problems instead of opportunities." Another executive grinned. "He's afraid of his own shadow." Someone near the end of the table whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "He's the weakest man in this building." More laughter followed. Daniel quietly gathered the untouched reports. Without another word, he walked out of the conference room. Behind the closed door, the laughter continued. None of them noticed Emily Carter watching from the hallway. She had joined Sterling Global only 8 months earlier as a financial analyst, and unlike most employees, she paid attention. She had watched Daniel for months. She noticed that every report he submitted was flawless. Every warning he gave eventually proved correct. Every mistake he identified saved the company millions of dollars. Yet somehow, he always received the blame instead of the credit. As Daniel returned to his office, Emily followed. She stopped outside his door. "I read your overseas report," she said quietly. Daniel looked up. "And?" "You were right." He smiled faintly. "I know." Emily hesitated. "If you know they're ignoring you, why do you stay?" Daniel closed the file in front of him. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "Because some buildings don't collapse the day the foundation begins to crack. They collapse when the weight becomes too heavy to carry." Emily frowned, unsure what he meant. Daniel looked through the glass wall toward the towering headquarters that employees proudly called untouchable. They think they've already won, he said softly. They haven't realized. Their empire is already beginning to fall. Outside his office, executives celebrated another record quarter. Champagne glasses clinked. Bonuses were announced. Laughter echoed across the executive floor. No one noticed the quiet compliance officer returning to his desk. No one imagined that inside the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet lay years of carefully organized evidence. Thousands of pages, encrypted storage drives, private recordings, signed financial records. Every lie, every illegal payment, every forged signature, every betrayal. The man they called weak wasn't collecting paperwork. He was collecting the pieces that would one day bring down an empire, and when that day arrived, the people who laughed the loudest would discover that silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation. Monday morning arrived with the same polished smiles, expensive suits, and rehearsed confidence that filled Sterling Global Holdings every single day. To anyone walking through the lobby, the company looked flawless. Employees greeted clients with perfect professionalism. Stock prices continued climbing. Financial news outlets praised Richard Sterling as one of the greatest business leaders of his generation. Inside the building, success seemed effortless. But Daniel Walker had spent 15 years learning a simple truth. The most dangerous corruption rarely announced itself. It hid behind polished boardrooms, carefully written reports, and people who knew exactly how much truth to reveal. As Daniel reviewed another stack of financial statements, one number caught his attention. It wasn't unusually large. It wasn't obviously wrong. It simply didn't belong. He compared it with last month's records. Then the previous quarter. The same transaction had appeared again. Different account. Different amount. Sam Destinacion. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Someone wasn't stealing money. Someone was moving it. Quietly. Carefully. Almost invisibly. Later that afternoon, Emily Carter knocked softly on his office door. "I found something strange," she whispered. She placed a folder on his desk. Daniel opened it without saying a word. Several invoices had been approved for construction projects that had never existed. The signatures looked authentic. The companies appeared legitimate. Yet every payment eventually disappeared into overseas accounts. Emily lowered her voice. "I checked 3 of these companies. They don't exist." Daniel closed the folder. Instead of looking surprised, he simply nodded. "As I expected." Emily stared at him. "You already knew?" "I suspected. But suspicion isn't evidence." Emily hesitated before asking the question that had been haunting her for weeks. "If you know something is wrong, why haven't you reported it?" Daniel looked through the office window toward the executive floor. "Because the moment they know someone is watching, they'll erase everything." That evening, after Emily had left, Daniel remained alone in his office. The company's internal employee archive stretched back more than 2 decades. On impulse, he searched for every compliance officer and internal auditor who had served Sterling Global before him. Most records were complete. One wasn't. Michael Reynolds, Senior Internal Auditor. 12 years of service. Status: resigned. Daniel frowned. There was no resignation letter. No exit interview. No forwarding address. Even stranger, almost every document connected to Michael Reynolds had been deleted. Only scattered fragments remained, as though someone had deliberately erased his existence. People didn't simply disappear from corporate records. Someone made them disappear. Daniel pulled out the small black notebook he always carried and wrote a single name: Michael Reynolds. Just then, Emily appeared at his office door. "I've never seen you stay this late before." Daniel looked up. "I'm looking for someone." She smiled. "A current employee?" He slowly shook his head. "No. Someone the company wants everyone to forget." Emily's expression changed. For the first time, she realized Daniel wasn't only investigating recent fraud, he was uncovering a secret buried years before either of them had joined the company. The following afternoon, Daniel drove to Sterling Global's off-site storage warehouse. Dust covered endless rows of aging document boxes that no one had touched in years. Most employees avoided the warehouse. Daniel preferred it that way. Hours passed before he found a faded archive box labeled Internal Audit, Confidential. Inside were routine reports, expense summaries, meeting minutes. Nothing unusual. Then a single folded memo slipped onto the floor. It had never been signed. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the top, someone had typed, "Immediate attention required." Daniel unfolded it carefully. The memo described suspicious overseas payments, unexplained transfers, and shell companies. The date stopped him cold. It had been written 9 years earlier. Someone else had discovered exactly what Daniel was finding now. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been underlined by hand. "If this report disappears, the corruption reaches the executive board." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. Michael Reynolds hadn't failed. He had been silenced. Daniel carefully returned the memo to its folder exactly as he had found it. As he walked out of the warehouse, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The conspiracy hadn't started recently. It had been growing in the shadows for nearly a decade. And if one honest auditor had vanished after uncovering the truth, Daniel might already be following the same path. The following evening, long after most employees had gone home, Daniel returned to the records department. The night security guard barely looked up. Daniel had worked late so often that no one questioned him anymore. That was exactly how he wanted it. He quietly compared archived contracts with digital payment records. 1 missing page, 2 altered signatures, 3 accounts that no longer matched the originals. By themselves, they meant very little. Together, they told a story, not of one dishonest executive, but of a system, a machine that had been operating for years. Daniel made no copies. He took no photographs. He simply wrote a few notes in the same small black notebook that never left his pocket. Across the hall, an office door clicked open. Footsteps echoed through the empty corridor. Daniel calmly closed the files and returned them to the cabinet. Marcus Steele, the company's head of security, appeared at the end of the hallway. His sharp eyes scanned the room. "You still working, Walker?" Daniel smiled politely. "Just finishing compliance reviews." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Then he walked away. Daniel waited until the footsteps disappeared. Only then did he release the slow breath he had been holding. For the first time in years, he realized someone inside the company had begun paying attention to him. And somewhere above him, behind the glass walls of the executive floor, a conversation had already begun. Richard Sterling stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Without turning around, he spoke. "Our compliance officer. He asks too many questions." Victoria Hayes looked at Marcus Steele. Marcus answered with a calm smile. "I'll handle him." None of them realized that the quiet man they considered harmless had already uncovered evidence reaching back nearly a decade. The game had begun. Neither side knew who would make the first mistake. The following weeks settled into an uneasy routine. By day, Daniel Walker remained exactly who everyone believed he was. The quiet compliance officer, the man who accepted impossible workloads without complaint. The employee executives barely acknowledged unless they needed someone to blame. Nothing about him appeared different. That was precisely how he intended it. While the executives congratulated themselves on another record-breaking quarter, Daniel began noticing something far more disturbing than suspicious financial transactions. People were disappearing, not physically, professionally. Employees who questioned unusual payments suddenly resigned. Senior accountants accepted early retirement without explanation. Auditors assigned to sensitive files were quietly transferred to offices thousands of miles away. Officially, each departure made perfect sense. Together, they formed a pattern. Every honest employee who looked too closely seemed to vanish before asking one question too many. Daniel quietly added each name to the same black notebook that already contained another forgotten name. Michael Reynolds, the missing auditor from 9 years earlier. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Daniel walked into the company's archive room, searching for audit reports from 6 years earlier. Half the files were gone. The digital records still listed them. The shelves where they should have been were empty. Someone hadn't misplaced them. Someone had removed them. As Daniel stood silently studying the empty space, the records manager approached. "You won't find those files." Daniel turned calmly. "What happened to them?" The man hesitated before answering. "I don't know." His voice said otherwise. Daniel didn't ask another question. Fear had already answered it. That evening, Emily Carter entered Daniel's office carrying a cardboard box. "I found these in storage," she whispered. Inside were backup invoices scheduled for destruction years earlier. Several pages carried handwritten approval signatures. One signature appeared again, and again, and again, always authorizing payments to different companies, always just below the reporting threshold that required outside review. Daniel carefully compared the signatures. They've been hiding in plain sight. Emily looked at him. Who? Daniel closed the folder. Not one person. A network. For the first time, Emily understood what she was facing. This wasn't one dishonest executive stealing company money. It was an organization protecting itself from the inside. Meanwhile, 40 floors above them, Richard Sterling called an unscheduled executive meeting. Marcus Steele stood beside the conference room door while Victoria Hayes distributed confidential folders. Richard spoke without raising his voice. Our compliance department has become curious. Silence filled the room. Victoria looked around the table. If anyone asks questions, they receive only the information we approve. Heads nodded. Marcus folded his arms. And Daniel Walker? Richard's expression hardened. Do nothing. Not yet. If he's simply doing his job, he'll eventually stop. Marcus wasn't convinced. People like him don't stop. Richard turned toward the windows overlooking the city, then make sure he has something else to worry about. The meeting ended without another word. The following Tuesday, Daniel noticed something unusual as he entered the compliance department. A small black dome had appeared above the hallway entrance. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary security camera, but Daniel knew the building's surveillance system well enough to recognize every recent upgrade. That camera hadn't been there the previous day. He continued walking as though nothing had changed. Inside his office, he calmly reviewed compliance reports while making a mental note of every angle the new camera could see. Minutes later, Marcus Steele stepped into the security control room. Is the new camera operational? He asked. A technician nodded. It gives us a direct view of Walker's office entrance. Marcus watched the monitor for several seconds. I don't care what he says. I want to know who visits him. Back in the compliance department, Emily stopped by Daniel's office carrying another routine file. Without looking directly at her, Daniel quietly said, "Smile." Emily looked puzzled but did exactly that. They exchanged a few ordinary words about audit schedules before she walked away. Only after she reached the elevator did her phone vibrate. Daniel's message contained only 6 words. They're watching everyone who visits me. Emily slowly looked back toward the hallway. The new camera stared silently from the ceiling. The investigation had entered a dangerous new phase. Neither of them was being watched by chance anymore. Late Friday evening, Daniel returned to the archive room to compare another set of financial records. The building was almost empty. Only the cleaning crew and a handful of security officers remained. The silence worked in his favor. It gave him time to think. Carefully, he removed an aging ledger from the shelf and compared it with the company's digital payment history. The numbers matched. The approvals did not. Several transactions had been rewritten after the original records were filed. Someone hadn't merely hidden the evidence. They had rewritten history. Daniel reached into the back cover of the ledger and removed a folded note that had been tucked inside years earlier. It contained account numbers, approval codes, and handwritten initials that matched the signatures Emily had discovered. For the first time, Daniel could connect the missing invoices, the overseas accounts, and the executives who had approved them. The conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was becoming evidence. Just as he slipped the note back into the ledger, footsteps echoed through the corridor. Steady, confident, unhurried. Marcus Steele. Daniel quietly closed the cabinet and stepped away just as Marcus rounded the corner. "What are you doing here, Walker?" Marcus asked. Daniel held up a routine compliance checklist. Quarterly records verification. Marcus extended his hand. "Let me see." For a brief second, Daniel felt the weight of the folded note hidden inside the ledger. If Marcus opened it, months of careful work could unravel in an instant. Without the slightest hesitation, Daniel handed over the checklist. Marcus studied every page. His eyes never left Daniel for long. "You spend an awful lot of time digging through old files," Daniel answered calmly. "Compliance isn't about today's records. It's about proving yesterday was honest." Marcus stared at him for several long seconds. The silence between them felt heavier than words. Finally, Marcus handed the checklist back. "Go home, Walker." Daniel gave a polite nod. Good night. He waited until Marcus disappeared around the corner. Only then did he remove the folded note from the hidden pocket inside the ledger. He slipped it into his briefcase and quietly switched off the archive lights. For the first time since the investigation began, Daniel realized just how close he had come to losing everything. One careless moment, one unnecessary movement, and the truth might have been buried forever. The following morning, Daniel arrived at his office earlier than usual. Nothing looked out of place. His desk was clean. His computer sat exactly where he had left it. His filing cabinet remained locked. To anyone else, the office appeared untouched. Daniel immediately noticed the differences. The framed photograph on his desk had been turned slightly to the left. A drawer closed just a fraction tighter than before. One folder rested beneath another instead of on top. Tiny details. Almost invisible, but impossible for Daniel to ignore. Someone had entered his office. Someone experienced enough to leave almost no trace. Someone who wanted him to know they had been there. Daniel quietly returned every item to its original position before anyone else arrived. Minutes later, Emily walked into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She stopped when she noticed Daniel standing silently beside his desk. Is everything all right? Daniel looked toward the executive floor through the glass walls above them. They searched my office. Emily's face lost its color. They found something? Daniel slowly shook his head. No. They were looking. Emily lowered her voice. Should we stop? Daniel finally turned to face her. If we stop now, Michael Reynolds stays forgotten. Everyone who disappeared stays forgotten. And they'll do it again. Emily nodded. For the first time, fear was no longer the strongest emotion she felt. Determination had replaced it. Across the building, Marcus Steele entered Richard Sterling's office. He noticed, Marcus said. Richard remained calm. I expected he would. Marcus folded his arms. He's more careful than we thought. Richard looked out over the city skyline. Good. Marcus frowned. Good? Richard smiled faintly. A cautious man eventually makes one mistake. We'll be waiting when he does. Neither of them realized Daniel had already changed the rules of the game. He wasn't collecting evidence inside the company anymore. He was building a case that could survive even if he disappeared. As the sun set behind Sterling Global's towering headquarters, Daniel locked his office and slipped the black notebook into his briefcase. Weeks earlier, he had been searching for the truth. Now the truth was searching for him. And somewhere behind the polished glass walls of the executive floor, powerful people had stopped asking whether Daniel Walker was a threat. They were asking something far more dangerous. How do we silence him before he exposes everything? The answer to that question would determine who walked away from Sterling Global, and who would lose everything. 3 days passed without incident. Sterling Global continued operating as though nothing had changed. Richard Sterling appeared on financial news celebrating another record-breaking quarter. Victoria Hayes approved multi-million-dollar contracts with the same confidence she always displayed. Marcus Steele quietly strengthened internal security, convinced that fear alone would keep everyone obedient. On the surface, the empire looked stronger than ever. Beneath that polished image, however, the first cracks had already begun to spread. Then, at exactly 8:17 on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. An encrypted email arrived at the headquarters of the Federal Financial Crimes Bureau. There was no sender, no signature, only one sentence. Start with Project Atlas, follow the overseas accounts. Attached were 12 documents: bank transfers, internal approvals, shell company registrations. Every document appeared authentic. Within an hour, forensic analysts reached the same conclusion. Someone inside Sterling Global had exposed part of a billion-dollar financial network. Across town, another anonymous package arrived at the office of one of the country's most respected investigative journalists. Inside were copies of invoices connected to companies that officially did not exist. The journalist studied each page in disbelief. If the documents were genuine, one of America's most admired corporations had spent years hiding an enormous financial conspiracy. Back inside Sterling Global, no one knew any of this had happened. Employees continued answering emails. Meetings carried on. Coffee machines hummed. Everything appeared normal. Then Richard Sterling's phone rang. He answered confidently. Within seconds, his expression changed. What do you mean, federal investigators? The boardroom fell silent. Victoria Hayes watched the color drain from his face. Richard slowly lowered the phone. They've requested access to our overseas financial records. No one spoke. Marcus Steele finally broke the silence. How much do they know? Richard looked around the room. I don't know. That answer frightened everyone. Victoria immediately ordered the finance department to suspend access to several archived accounts. Within minutes, executives hurried through the hallways carrying confidential files. Servers were taken offline for what employees were told was routine maintenance. Entire departments received instructions to cooperate with no one outside the company without executive approval. The panic had begun. Downstairs, Daniel Walker watched employees rushing between offices. He didn't ask questions. He simply observed. Emily Carter approached quietly. Something's happening upstairs. Daniel nodded. I know. She studied his face. Did you expect this? Daniel remained silent for a moment. I expected the truth to arrive. I just didn't know when. For the first time, Emily realized Daniel wasn't surprised. He had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else knew the investigation existed. 48 hours later, the anonymous leaks had already begun changing lives far beyond Sterling Global's headquarters. Senior investigator Laura Bennett stood before a wall covered with financial charts, corporate records, and photographs of Sterling Global's senior executives. Red lines connected shell companies across 3 continents. Every connection led back to the same small circle of executives. She looked around the conference table. This isn't an isolated fraud case. It's a coordinated criminal enterprise. One investigator raised a concern. If this reaches as high as the evidence suggests, they'll start destroying records. Laura nodded. Which is why we move before they realize how much we already know. Across town, investigative journalist Michael Ross reached the same conclusion. His editor carefully reviewed the growing stack of verified documents. We're not publishing yet, she said. Every fact must survive legal review. Michael nodded. If we're right, this story won't just expose a corporation. It could bring down one of the most powerful business empires in the country. For the next 2 days, investigators quietly interviewed former employees. Financial experts verified the shell companies. Independent auditors confirmed suspicious transaction patterns stretching back nearly a decade. One piece of evidence led to another. Anonymous allegations slowly became documented proof. Meanwhile, inside Sterling Global, Richard Sterling still believed his greatest threat was the person leaking information. He had no idea the evidence now existed far beyond the walls of his company. Government investigators had it. Journalists had it. Independent experts had verified it. Even if every document inside Sterling Global disappeared overnight, the truth already had too many witnesses. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling's empire was no longer protected by silence. It had become the target of people who could not be intimidated. Inside Sterling Global, the atmosphere changed by the hour. Employees lowered their voices whenever managers walked past. Conversations ended the moment an executive entered the room. Entire departments suddenly found themselves locked out of files they had accessed for years. No explanation was given. No one dared to ask for one. The company that had once celebrated transparency now operated behind a wall of silence. Late that evening, Marcus Steele assembled his senior security team inside the surveillance control room. Large monitors displayed live camera feeds from every floor of the building. Employee access logs filled another screen. Marcus stood at the front of the room. Nobody leaves this building with company files. His voice was calm, but every person in the room understood the urgency. Review every security recording from the past 6 months. Audit every printer. Cross-check every access card. I want to know who entered every archive room. And when. One security supervisor hesitated before speaking. What if the leak didn't happen this week? Marcus looked directly at him. What do you mean? What if whoever exposed us has been collecting evidence for months? Or even years? The room fell silent. Marcus slowly nodded. Then we've already given them a head start. He turned back toward the monitors, which means we stop looking for documents and start looking for people. Within hours, quiet surveillance spread throughout Sterling Global. Employee emails were reviewed. Access records were examined. Visitors were questioned. Routine conversations became intelligence reports. Without realizing it, the executives had transformed their own headquarters into a place where no one trusted anyone. Downstairs, Daniel noticed the change immediately. The receptionist who normally smiled each morning barely looked up. Managers stopped talking whenever he entered a room. Even longtime employees seemed afraid to make eye contact. Emily quietly joined him near the records department. "They're watching everyone." Daniel nodded. "They're not searching for evidence anymore. They're searching for the person who found it." Emily glanced around the hallway. "Do you think they'll find you?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "They're asking the wrong questions." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're looking for someone acting suspicious." He gave a faint smile. "I've spent 15 years making sure no one noticed me." That quiet confidence reassured Emily more than any promise could have. Meanwhile, investigators continued building their case. Every new subpoena uncovered another layer of hidden transactions. Every witness confirmed part of the anonymous evidence. What had begun as 12 leaked documents had expanded into hundreds of financial records spanning nearly a decade. The investigation was no longer dependent on one source. It had become self-sustaining. Back inside Sterling Global, Richard Sterling stood alone in his office overlooking the city skyline. For years, he had believed success made him untouchable. Now, for the first time, he questioned that belief. Victoria Hayes entered quietly. "Our attorneys are asking whether we should prepare for federal interviews." Richard remained silent. She stepped closer. "They think this investigation is growing." Richard finally spoke. "It isn't growing. It's spreading." Neither of them noticed how different those words sounded. This was no longer a problem that could be solved inside a boardroom. The empire was beginning to crack from the outside. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The small black notebook rested on the kitchen table beside him. He opened it slowly. Beneath the names of missing auditors, hidden shell companies, and years of carefully gathered observations, he wrote 2 simple words: Phase 1. Then, with calm satisfaction, he drew a single line through them. Completed. He closed the notebook, switched off the light, and looked out through the apartment window toward the distant glow of Sterling Global headquarters. He knew the hardest part of the battle was still ahead. Exposing corruption was one thing. Proving it in a courtroom would be something else entirely. Miles away, Richard Sterling stood alone in the darkness of his executive office. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him. For the first time in decades, he felt something he had almost forgotten: fear. Because somewhere beyond the walls of his billion-dollar empire, someone had fired the first shot. And whoever that person was, they knew exactly where to aim. The war for Sterling Global had officially begun. And before it was over, one side would lose everything. By Wednesday morning, Sterling Global was no longer the confident corporation the world admired. The polished smiles remained. The expensive suits still filled the executive floor. But beneath the carefully maintained image, fear had taken control. Federal investigators had not filed charges. The media had not published a single story. Yet everyone in the boardroom understood the same terrifying truth. Someone inside the company had betrayed them. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the conference table, his eyes fixed on every executive in the room. "We have a leak." No one responded. The question is not whether someone is talking. The question is, who? Marcus Steele slid a thin folder onto the table. "I've narrowed the list." Richard opened it. Inside were the names of 12 employees who had accessed financial records connected to the overseas accounts. One name had been circled in red: Daniel Walker. Victoria Hayes leaned forward. "The compliance officer?" Marcus nodded. "He asks too many questions. He stays late. And every investigation seems to begin with records he has reviewed." Richard closed the folder. "Do not touch him." The room fell silent. Victoria frowned. "If he's responsible..." Richard raised a hand. "I didn't say he was responsible. I said we don't know. If we move too soon, we could expose ourselves." Marcus understood immediately. "You want him to make a mistake." Richard smiled for the first time in days. Exactly. The meeting should have ended there. Instead, the room grew even quieter. No one moved. No one looked comfortable. The executive boardroom no longer felt like a place of confidence. It felt like a courtroom. One executive finally broke the silence. We should have destroyed those records months ago." Victoria turned sharply. "And whose department approved those transactions in the first place?" The executive looked away. Another board member leaned forward. "We're wasting time blaming each other." Marcus folded his arms. "No, we're finding out who made the first mistake." Richard slowly looked around the table. "What matters isn't who leaked the information. What matters is who created the trail that investigators are following." Again, silence. For the first time in years, trust had disappeared from the executive floor. Every person in the room wondered whether someone else might already be cooperating with federal authorities. The alliance that had protected Sterling Global for nearly a decade was beginning to crack. Richard ended the meeting with a single instruction: no one acts alone. If anyone makes another mistake, it won't be investigators who destroy this company. It will be us. The following morning, Daniel arrived at work to discover his security access had been downgraded. Several files he normally reviewed were suddenly restricted. His company email had been placed under monitoring. 2 unfamiliar security officers stood near the compliance department throughout the day. No explanation was offered. None was necessary. Daniel understood the message. They were watching him. Emily noticed it as well. "They're trying to box you in," she whispered. Daniel remained calm. When people stop trusting their own walls, they begin building prisons. Emily glanced toward the executive floor. "So what do we do?" Daniel allowed himself the faintest smile. "We let them believe it's working." Over the next several days, Daniel became exactly what the executives expected. He stopped asking difficult questions. He left the office on time. He accepted every new restriction without complaint. From every surveillance report, he appeared to be retreating. Marcus reviewed the daily updates with growing confidence. One security officer looked up from his report. "Walker has backed off." Marcus slowly shook his head. "No, he's thinking." That answer lingered in the room long after the meeting ended. Deep down, Marcus no longer feared what Daniel had already done. Every employee had gone home. He feared what Daniel might do next. Marcus Steele stood outside Daniel Walker's office. He waited until the last member of the cleaning crew disappeared down the corridor. Then he quietly unlocked the door. For nearly 40 minutes, he searched every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf, every file. He examined Daniel's computer. He checked behind picture frames. He even inspected the ceiling panels. Nothing. Not a single confidential document. Not one suspicious file. No hidden storage devices. No evidence. Marcus stepped back into the hallway, frustrated. The quiet compliance officer had become the biggest mystery inside Sterling Global. As Marcus disappeared around the corner, a maintenance worker pushed a cleaning cart toward the service elevator. He never looked in Marcus's direction. He simply continued walking at an unhurried pace before entering the elevator and disappearing underground. Minutes later, inside the parking garage, Daniel removed the maintenance uniform. He folded it neatly into a storage locker and walked toward a row of secure courier boxes. From inside his briefcase, he removed a sealed envelope. Without hesitation, he placed it into the collection locker. The door clicked shut. Another package had begun its journey. Inside were original board approvals, private correspondence, financial authorizations carrying the signatures of Richard Sterling and Victoria Hayes, documents Sterling Global believed had been destroyed years earlier. By sunrise, those records would be in federal hands. The following Monday, panic erupted inside the executive suite. Another confidential file had reached investigators. Marcus slammed his fist against the conference table. "This is impossible. We searched him. We monitored him. We locked down every department." Richard Sterling remained calm. Then he quietly said, "No, we locked down the wrong person." The words echoed through the room. For the first time, the executives considered a possibility none of them wanted to believe. The leak wasn't reacting to their moves. It was staying ahead of them, no matter what they did. Someone always seemed prepared. The meeting ended without resolution. No one trusted anyone enough to speak freely anymore. Late that night, Victoria Hayes remained alone in her office. Her laptop screen filled with urgent messages, federal subpoenas, frozen overseas accounts, emergency meetings with corporate attorneys. Every email carried the same unmistakable message. The walls were closing in. She slowly closed the computer and reached for her phone. After several rings, a familiar voice answered. "We need to talk," Victoria said quietly. "This isn't the right time," the voice replied. "There may not be another time." Victoria walked toward the window overlooking the city. Her voice became almost a whisper. "If this falls apart, I'm not going down alone." The call ended. Across the hallway, Marcus Steele watched Victoria's office through the security cameras. He couldn't hear the conversation, but years in corporate security had taught him how to recognize fear. He picked up the internal phone. "Keep an eye on Victoria. I think she's preparing to save herself." Within hours, suspicion spread across the executive floor. Closed doors remained locked longer than usual. Private conversations ended the moment another executive approached. Assistants noticed documents disappearing from filing cabinets. Longtime allies suddenly avoided one another in the hallways. The conspiracy that had survived nearly a decade was beginning to consume itself. Meanwhile, Daniel knew nothing about Victoria's late-night call. He didn't need to. He had predicted this moment from the very beginning. People driven by greed rarely stayed loyal when prison became a possibility. Fear always exposed the weakest link. As another ordinary workday began, Daniel quietly returned to his desk. Employees hurried past without giving him a second glance. Some still whispered that he was weak. Others barely remembered his name. Daniel acknowledged none of them. His attention remained fixed on the work in front of him, because while the executives searched every hallway, reviewed every camera, questioned every employee, and turned against one another, they still hadn't discovered the one truth that mattered most. Their greatest enemy wasn't hiding. He was sitting in plain sight, patiently watching an empire destroy itself from within. And with every passing hour, the day of reckoning moved one step closer. Over the following months, federal investigators quietly assembled the evidence. Every anonymous document led to another witness. Every financial trail uncovered another hidden transaction. The net tightened so gradually that the executives convinced themselves they still had time. They were wrong. Monday began like every other trading day on Wall Street. Television anchors discussed quarterly earnings. Investors watched market forecasts. Employees filled the lobby of Sterling Global Holdings, believing the company would weather yet another storm. No one knew they were witnessing the final morning of an empire. At precisely 9 a.m., every major news network interrupted its regular programming. A federal press conference was about to begin. Reporters crowded the room. Camera shutters flashed without pause. Then the director of the Federal Financial Crimes Bureau stepped to the podium. Following a months-long investigation supported by extensive documentary evidence, federal authorities have executed multiple search warrants involving Sterling Global Holdings. A wave of whispers spread through the room. Behind the director, large screens displayed financial records, shell company transactions, forged approvals, and bank transfers tied to senior executives. The evidence was overwhelming. Across the country, millions watched in disbelief. Inside Sterling Global headquarters, television screens fell silent. Employees stopped working. Phones rang unanswered. No one moved. Richard Sterling stood frozen in the executive boardroom. Victoria Hayes stared at the television as every secret they had spent years burying appeared before the world. Marcus Steele reached for his phone. There was no signal, not because the network had failed, because federal agents had already secured the executive floor. A loud knock echoed through the boardroom. The doors opened. Men and women wearing federal jackets entered with calm, practiced confidence. The lead agent unfolded a warrant. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy, financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple related federal offenses." No one spoke. The room that had once echoed with laughter became silent. Richard slowly looked around the boardroom. The same executives who had praised his leadership now refused to meet his eyes. Victoria's hands trembled. Marcus took a single step backward before another agent stopped him. "There will be no need for that." Within minutes, handcuffs replaced expensive watches. Power disappeared faster than anyone imagined. Downstairs, hundreds of employees watched in stunned silence as the executives who had ruled through fear were escorted through the lobby. Some cried. Some stood motionless. Others quietly applauded. Among the crowd stood Daniel Walker, exactly where he had always stood. Quiet, calm, invisible. Marcus noticed him first. "It was you," he whispered. Daniel said nothing. Marcus lowered his head. "We never saw you coming," Daniel answered quietly. You never looked. As Richard was led toward the exit, his eyes finally settled on Daniel. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard gave a slow, bitter smile. All these years, I thought you were the weakest man in this company. Daniel looked at him with the same calm expression he had carried for 15 years. You were looking for strength in the loudest voice. You never realized it lives in character. Richard lowered his head. For the first time in his career, he had nothing left to say. Hours later, investigators continued removing boxes of evidence from the building. Employees were interviewed one by one. The company's board announced Richard Sterling's immediate removal. Trading of Sterling Global stock was suspended. By the closing bell, billions of dollars in market value had vanished. The empire that had taken decades to build had collapsed in a single day. That evening, Emily Carter found Daniel standing outside the headquarters. The giant company logo reflected the setting sun. It's over, she said quietly. Daniel looked at the building. The investigation is over. Now the rebuilding begins. Several weeks later, an independent board appointed new leadership. Employees who had spent years afraid to speak were finally heard. Ethics replaced intimidation. Transparency replaced secrecy. Daniel was offered the position of Chief Executive Officer. He thanked the board for its confidence. Then he declined. Instead, he accepted responsibility for rebuilding the company's ethics and compliance division. He had never wanted power. He wanted accountability. On his first morning in the new office, he unlocked the same worn leather briefcase he had carried for 15 years. Inside rested the small black notebook that had accompanied him through every setback, every insult, and every quiet victory. He opened the final page. There was only one sentence. The truth does not rush. It arrives exactly when every lie runs out of places to hide. Daniel closed the notebook and placed it inside his desk. Outside, the sun rose over a city that was beginning a new chapter. The empire that had mocked his silence no longer existed. Because, in the end, they thought silence was weakness. It was the silence that buried their empire. If you really stayed until the end, thank you. This story reminds us that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet courage to do what's right when no one is watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, comment below, subscribe to Cognora, and share this video with your friends and family. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And here's a question for you. At what moment did you realize Daniel was going to bring down the entire empire? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.